Today we will be covering federal involvement in gifted and talented education, coming from Chapter 47 by Patricia O'Connell. Whose responsibility? The gifted and talented education programs have always been a state and local responsibility. The U.S. Constitution does not mention education as a federal responsibility, but the Constitution does declare that education is the responsibility of the state. That's why, as we have seen in our readings and our findings, that definition and practice of gifted programs vary from state to state and even from district to district. Some things that have helped form the federal involvement in gifted and talented education. The first one is the Sputnik era. With the launch of Sputnik, that sent America into widespread panic. There was much debate and conflict over the quality of education provided in the country, particularly in the areas of math and science. Students need a more rigorous secondary curriculum need for the broader opportunities at higher levels of education. During this time, the U.S. public believed the country would continue to flounder from emphasis of outside forces if the education system did not improve. Arguments over America losing the Cold War due to our educational system. In 1958, Congress passed the National Defense Education Act, and there was a press for students in math and science. During this time, this was the first major federal legislation supporting education. It provided funding for testing to identify able students for counseling and guidance, and to encourage students to attend college, particularly in areas of math and science. By pushing students in math and science areas, the U.S. felt this was our way to improve our standing with the Soviet Union. However, during the Sputnik era, the focus was on national need, not on individual student focus or on student performance, but on helping the United States look better in the face of the Cold War. The push in math and science and education as a whole was for the abled student only, the ones who were excellent or excelling in math or science, not on the whole student body. With the success of the space program and the end of the Sputnik crisis, support for abled students trickled down to a little bit of nothing. The rights of special children. In the 1960s and 70s, there was a rise in educational rights demanded for all individuals, particularly in the disenfranchised. The Great Society legislation became known as Title I. Marland report showed that programs for gifted and talented students were non-existent during this time. After the Sputnik era and the space race slowed down and came to an eventual end, so did the emphasis and focus on educating the nation's talented and gifted students. The Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1981 provided modest funds of gifted and talented were lumped together along with 19 other programs, and the states were given this lump sum to use at their own discretion to divide how they wanted to use this money to support their education. Title I came about to advocate and help educate disadvantaged students. In early drafts of the legislation, gifted and talented were included as a category of exceptionality. Eventually, the terminology of gifted and talented was removed. At the time, there was a focus on student rights and equal opportunity, and arguments formed around the gifted and talented students needing their needs met and catered to. Current reform initiatives in federal policy. The Jacob K. Javits Gifted and Talented Students Education Act of 1988 was a small federal program for gifted and talented programs. It was created as part of the most intense and sustained school reform movement in the history of the nation. In 1989, George Bush and the nation's governors met to discuss a unified set of expectations for education in America. They came up with a set of goals, and Goal 3 of the National Education Goals. The Jacob K. Javits placed special emphasis on economically disadvantaged students, limited proficient students, and students with disabilities who are gifted and talented. In Goal 3 of the National Education Goals, students of all levels of accomplishment need to be performing at higher levels This is also the same mission as the Javits program stated. The National Education Goals presented a broad framework for the national direction of education. This was a big step forward for national education as a whole. Continuing on, Congress passed several more important pieces of legislation. The Goals 2000 Educate America Act provided funds to states to develop standards, frameworks, and assessments for what students should know. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA, focused on K-12 education programs to help students achieve higher academic success, suggested all students need complex curriculum, enrichment, and acceleration. Through ESEA, all students had to be assessed based on the same standards. At-risk students were expected to meet the same standards as other students. National Excellence, a case for developing America's talent. This came about in 1993. This offered to show how America was serving gifted and talented students and the suggested direction on how to improve education practices for these students. The United States is squandering one of its most precious resources, the gifts, talents, and high interests of many of its students. This was one of the main points of this report made to the United States public. It wanted to know that because the needs and development of the gifted and talented programs were not being met, therefore one of America's richest and most precious resources was being squandered or not used to its full potential. The report provided some ideas for improvement, such as establishing challenging curriculum standards, establishing high-level learning opportunities, ensuring access to early childhood education, expanding opportunities for disadvantaged and minority children, encouraging appropriate teacher training, and matching world performance. This report made the case that although some programs for gifted and talented students existed, most were limited and minimal at the time. They did not push gifted and talented students in their potential to succeed. The 1993 report said that gifted and talented education was just as important as education in the nation at large. The No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 had four main points that it wanted to make. The No Child Left Behind Act reauthorized ESEA and covered federal programs for K-12 education. It provided more choices for parents and students, particularly in low-performing schools, offered flexibility for states and LEAs in use of federal funds, and placed emphasis on reading for young children. This report offers the biggest change in federal education policy in a generation. The four areas that it focused on were accountability, that states are required to implement statewide accountability systems based on challenging state standards in reading and math particularly. It also wanted to focus on testing students in grades 3 through 8 each year for their improved performance on assessments, particularly in math and reading. It provides choice. Low-income students can use Title I funds to obtain supplemental educational services from public or from private sector providers that are selected by the parents, and the student can also have some say. It provides greater flexibility to transfer up to 50% of funding to the states. States have the choice of how they would like to spend up to 50% of their funding. They can either decide to transfer money into one of these four programs of teacher quality state grants, educational technology, innovative programs, safe and drug-free schools, or to put this money toward Title I. The last and most important emphasis of No Child Left Behind was reading. They wanted to increase the funding in reading on scientifically based reading programs, especially in the early grades. In summary, education continues to be an important expanding concern of the federal government. While responsibility is the state's, the federal government is demanding accountability and results for all students. The Javits program continues to provide direction on ways to close achievement gap for students at high-performing levels. Questions to consider and answer in the forum below. You may choose one. Why do you think the federal government historically has taken a minimal role in gifted education? Or, the federal government's role in gifted education began as a response to the Cold War and Sputnik. What do you think is a driving force behind the federal role in gifted education today?